As New York's leading band leader with the widest access to the press, James Reese Europe reinforced the notion and power of black musical, quote, authenticity, unquote, as defined by himself. He did this while providing the dance music for two white dancers, the world-renowned Vernon and Irene Castle, who ironically packaged their product as distancing itself from African American culture. Thus, American popular music and culture at this time was a cross-racial and interracial cultural production, paradoxically founded on conventional ideas of natural and inherent differences between the races. Europe shaped the trope of black music, which we still have with us. Burt Williams and other blackface vaudevillians had started the process in the 1890s for commercial reasons to reclaim the name and symbolic meaning of Negro music, and through Europe, this became a stark delineation of the musical character of a race. This demarcation of vast inherent racial differences was to be endemic to pop culture, present from the Big Bang of blackface performance and minstrelsy, wherein white entertainers competed fiercely to stake their claim to purveying only the most authentic Negro music. Thus began pop music's obsessive cult of authenticity. In the case of blackface performers, many like Virginia minstrel Daniel Decatur Emmett, who named the South and gave it an anthem with the song Dixie, had never been South in their lives, much less on a plantation. Makes it easy to understand how Emmett could have dared to speak as he does in Dixie for a black man in New York longing to be back in slavery in the South. Thus, the ideas of black authenticity circulating at the Marshall Hotel since the late 19th century radiated out into the Manhattan entertainment markets and across the United States by way of James Reese Europe. Popular representations of black music and its authenticity came to conform more and more to Europe's image. Europe defined black music's main characteristic as rhythm, its syncopation. The one-step dances done to this syncopation were so simple that over 100 dances were invented in New York in the 1910s. So-called tough dances or animal dances, named for animals that is, where arms, torsos, necks, and heads could move in a wide variety of ways. The dance music Europe popularized emphasized expression of the body, not just doing the correct steps. In 1914, the New York Tribune said Europe had secured complete control of the cabaret and dance field in the city. Europe defined ragtime for mass consumption as opposed to the rough form played in the Tenderloin district by creating new combinations of musical form and instrumentation. By 1915, James Weldon Johnson reported that black musicians in New York earned more money on average than white musicians. Blacks charged more at this time because Europe had augmented the professional and cultural value of black dance bands. The blackness of Europe's skin and the perceived blackness of his rhythmic music stamped the castles with a racial authenticity few others could claim. So to recap the effects of Europe's partnership with Irene and Vernon Castle and others following Europe's lead, number one, it advanced ideologies of natural and inherent differences between the races. Number two, it promoted simplified, essentialist ideas of black people and black culture. Number three, it made rhythmic, syncopated, and electrifying dance music the primary type of black music in the United States. The black music listened to by Frederick Douglass and that which became popular shortly after his death was vastly different. A lot of this has trickled down to the identity politics of today, which makes race and gender just about the only factors to consider sometimes. But at that time, these ideas put African Americans in a box. Negro music, black rhythm, and black authenticity conjured up notions of folk primitivism for many whites. Thus, in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, black music became a trap from which its originators would never escape. Even at the time, innovators like Will Marion Cook and J. Rosamond Johnson did everything they could to create heterogeneous, sophisticated, and modern representations of African Americans, and they still ended up conscribing racially determined cultural commodities. So the idea expanded through the music that black people were just born different. This ended up making discrimination worse. During this period, the rapidly advancing social services criminalized blackness, but not immigrants, not white immigrants. Immigrants were seen as being able to assimilate, but African Americans were seen as largely unfit for full citizenship in America. Blacks were just born different, as was reinforced by black artists and white elites, assigning them as being the only ones capable of performing certain types of music. It did not help matters that President Woodrow Wilson was the first president who was the son of 2 Confederate sympathizers. He followed the racist, warmongering, and possibly insane Theodore Roosevelt, whose maternal uncle was the head of the Confederate Secret Service in Europe, and also the first Skull and Bones president, William Howard Taft. Wilson reinstituted segregation in the civil service, eliminating one of the most powerful forces for strength and stability in African American life. Even worse, Wilson lent presidential prestige to the vitriolically white supremacist first blockbuster film, Birth of a Nation, based on a novel by John D. Rockefeller's pastor entitled The Klansman. This god-awful hate piece was the first movie screened in the White House ever. Birth of a Nation was already a bona fide social phenomenon, with thousands taking excursion trains from the countryside into the city to view the movie. The result was widespread violence against blacks and the resurrection of the long-dead Ku Klux Klan as a national, not just Southern, organization. The NAACP fought in vain for the film's ban. My own feeling is that the film was part of the occult brotherhood strategy to divide and conquer the races. Also, they patronized black philanthropy at the same time as an example of the Hegelian dialectic, so as to create chaos and remake a homogenized culture in their own image. The Wilson administration would complete the fall of America under the influence of his aide, some say handler, Colonel Edward Mandell House. The son of a British slave owner in Texas, House was a crucial networker in the Anglo-American establishment. He stewarded the overthrow of American sovereignty by pushing for the Federal Reserve System, which placed our nation's financial well-being in the hands of foreign bankers. In collusion with those foreign bankers, House sold Wilson on the idea of the League of Nations, a forerunner of global government. There was still enough independence in America to turn back this assault. The idea of world governance was a likely motivator for our completely unnecessary involvement in World War I under false pretenses, and then on the side of England, which had been perceived as an American nemesis up to that point in history. The wealthy members of the Eastern establishment and their ideological brothers in London had grown rich together in the Opium Wars, forcing China to addict its population at gunpoint. Following the advice of his advisor and controller, Colonel House, Wilson incessantly provoked Germany with support of Great Britain and led us into the mindless and pointless slaughter of World War I. Wilson continued to show no backbone and capitulated to the Anglophile elite with the Versailles Treaty. This treaty decimated Germany to a point which enabled Hitler to rise as a perceived national savior. The Wilson administration also laid the groundwork for the twin scourges of the drugs and the drug war, which would disproportionately affect people of color in the decades to come. In the Wilson years, heroin and cocaine were outlawed by the 1914 Harrison Act, and alcohol also as a result of the Volstead Act. The elite had closely watched the trial run of Canadian Prohibition 4 years before, which led to the ascendancy of the Bronfman gang of Seagram liquor fame, who would exercise profound influence in the new American mafia, and not surprisingly play a critical role in financing gangster rap decades later. Prohibition created such potential for unprecedented profit that vast networks of organized crime were built, which persist to this very day. The price of drugs skyrocketed, and so did crime and vice, which has increasingly been pushed into the African American neighborhoods, while at the same time providing an excuse for a veritable police state in poorer communities. A cultural milestone was laid when James Reese Europe played Carnegie Hall on May 2, 1912, one day after the occult celebration May Day Beltane. This was the first time a black-led black band had ever played in the prestigious venue. One of the sponsors of this event was Natalie Curtis, an ethnomusicologist who had done a lot of work with the Hopi and the Navajo. She was another well-to-do, well-educated white person enamored of the so-called primitive and the so-called noble savage. She was a close friend of Theodore Roosevelt and a founder of the Colored Music Settlement School in Harlem. Natalie Curtis is an early example of what was to become a deep and long-standing pattern of cultural revolution by academics in the field of anthropology, folklore, and ethnomusicology. This has filtered down to our day in ethnic studies and identity politics. We are going to see this in the folk music revival movements of the 30s and late 50s, early 60s, which led straight into the sex and drug counterculture of the hippies. This thread also weaves through the popularity of various Eastern religions and magical cult beliefs. But that landmark Carnegie concert would never have gotten off the ground had it not been for the timely aid of newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst. A man highly responsible for pushing America into its first overseas imperialist war in 1898, Hearst used the full power of his newspapers to incite public opinion. This technique was also employed to instigate and garner support for World War I by Rothschild agent J.P. Morgan, who commissioned a study to find out how many newspapers he would have to buy to sway public opinion towards getting involved in the war, 25 finally being the magical number. Hearst flexed his creative cultural muscle on behalf of James Reese Europe for some reason which surely had nothing to do with his belief in the brotherhood of man. On the day before the Carnegie concert, which was Beltane on the witchcraft calendar, 2,000 of the 3,000 tickets to the event remained unsold. William Randolph Hearst had his New York Evening Journal run a major article touting how this was the one event that no one could miss. Predictably, with this kind of glowing free publicity, thousands were turned away from the concert the next day, and history was made. Another example of power elite coziness with the ragtime jazz social dancing culture shift occurred at a dance contest at Madison Square Garden, music provided by James Reese Europe. The winners were a dignified middle-aged couple, Mr. and Mrs. Sailing Baruch, brother of powerhouse Wall Street financier Bernard Baruch, who was soon to be appointed by President Wilson to the Council of National Defense. He would be a confidant to American presidents thereafter, most conspicuously FDR. In spite of much Christian opposition, almost always portrayed as oppressive and mean-spirited in today's writing, the hands of the power elite are all over the promotion of the ragtime to jazz age social dance craze. This was social engineering on a massive scale and an aggressive advance in spiritual warfare, whether consciously or not, to most of the combatants. We have fallen so far away from biblical principles that we look at this Christian opposition as quaint at best or tyrannical at worst. Either way, we simply do not comprehend or understand it. It has been rendered foreign to us by decades of conditioning and programming. It is instructive to read examples of the plentiful opposition to social dancing and the new practices of bodily contact that accompanied it, contemporary to the time. Many of these were collected early on in 1904's Immorality of Modern Dances, which states its intended audience to be Protestant and Roman Catholic clergy, as well as Jewish rabbis. It is humbly dedicated to the well-minded and loving parents of America long before they abdicated the responsibility of prohibiting sex among their underage children. In this collection, several clergy cite the early church fathers' admonishment against many types of dancing. For example, Saint Maximus of Turin in 45 AD, who denounces dancing as contrary to the piety of those who follow Christ, and renounces whatever holds a man wedded to the passions of the world. Plutarch calls certain types of dancing a spur to lust, citing the case of Helena carried away by Theseus. Saint Ambrose in 397 cites the dancing of Salome before Herod, which at the behest of her lustful mother produced the martyrdom of John the Baptist. But as I said, today's culture is so far removed from this kind of thinking that we cannot even empathize with it or respect it as a legitimate point of view. That dancing of Salome before Herod inspired one of the major pop culture phenomenons of the early 20th century and a major blow against Bible-based belief in the Messiah. We'll look at the Salome dance mania in the third part of Ragtime Revolutions and the Counter-Christ Culture. We will also look at a little possible occult gematria surrounding the life and death of James Reese Europe. And we will endeavor to discern the occult moves being made on the chessboard of race by the power elite brotherhoods in the music and dance of the 1910s, and how seeds planted at that time have been harvested since, and what we shall reap thereby, not only in our own time, but in the not so distant future. This is Gumbo Craig, and this is Walking Out of Babylon. All glory is always to the Most High God, and never for our little selves down here on the dark earth. May the peace of Messiah grace your life and the lives of all those whom you love. Shalom.